Having the right rod for the lure that you are fishing can not only help you to fish that lure more effectively, but it's going to help you to land more bass on that specific lure. And today I want to talk about how to select the right rod for the lures that you are fishing. So let's dive on in. Now, this is probably one of the biggest questions that I get asked on the channel is, hey, what rod and reel and setup do you throw for that specific lure? So I really want to help you kind of work through the process of knowing exactly what rod you should choose for the lure that you are throwing. And I have a very simple process when it comes to this, but in order to really understand what rods that you are throwing, you really need to understand the two biggest components of a rod, and that is the rod power and the rod action. This is something that gets kind of thrown all over the place. You hear a lot of guys talk about a heavy action rod or a medium heavy action rod, and that's actually the wrong thing, because anytime you're referring to heavy or medium heavy, what you're really talking about is the power of a rod. Now, action, you'll hear a lot is like fast action, moderate action. And real quick, I want to talk about the differences between those, because understanding the rod power and rod action will help you to pick out the right rod for the lure that you are fishing. Let's first start with rod power. Rod power is defined by the amount of weight it takes to bend or flex that rod. So if you're using a heavy power rod, it's going to take a heavier weight or a heavier lure to bend or flex that rod. If you're using a light power rod, it's going to take very light weight, sometimes little micro jigs, Ned rigs to bend that rod. Now, if you're using a medium heavy, that's kind of somewhere in between. That's a very easy concept, I think, for most of us to understand. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what defines a heavy lure versus a light lure? And this is some very general terms, but it's something that I've seen a lot in bass fishing, is that if you're fishing a lure that is anywhere from about 3/8 of an ounce to 3/4 of an ounce, that is where I'm going to use a medium heavy most of the time. 3/8 to 3/4, that is kind of where I use a lot of medium heavy power rods. Now, anything over 3/4 is when I'm going to get into the heavy power or extra heavy power rods. Now, anything lighter than 3/8 of an ounce is when I'm going to use a medium or medium light or even a light power rod. That is definitely not an absolute, but that is something that I've seen that I use a lot in my bass fishing. Now, let's talk real quick about rod action. This is extremely important to understand, because if you look at these two rods that I'm holding right here, these rods are nearly identical. They are both 7 foot, 11 inches long. They are both heavy power rods, but this rod over here is a fast action rod. This rod over here is a moderate action rod. And this is huge when it comes to bass fishing. Now, the action of a rod really tells you where on that rod it is going to bend. If you are fishing an extra fast action rod, typically we call those 80-20 rods, meaning 80% of it is backbone and the top 20% is where that rod actually flexes. If you're fishing a fast action rod, typically this is more of a 70-30 rod. 70% backbone and the top 30% is where you're gonna have most of your flex. Now, if you're fishing a moderate action rod, typically this is somewhere around 50-50 to 60-40, meaning that 50% of that rod is backbone and the top 50% bends. Now, moderate, fast, and extra fast are not the only actions that you're going to see in rods. You have rods that are kind of in between, like moderate fast action rods. You also have rods that are really slow action rods. I don't tend to use these a lot in bass fishing. I did back in the day. I owned a David Fritz rod that was a slow action rod. It was made out of glass and that thing bent at the rod handle. Now, personally, I use either moderate action rods or fast action rods probably 90% of the time. I will use some moderate fast kind of in between from time to time. I don't really use the extra fast anymore because, again, that's an 80-20 rod, and so it's a little bit stiffer, I guess you could say, and I tend to break off because I set the hook really hard. Now, if you don't set the hook really hard, you may be able to be just fine with an extra fast. Now, the thing that you should know about actions is that the fast and extra fast action rods are a lot more sensitive. You can pick up on bites a lot better. You can actually feel what's down there on the bottom better. Now, the moderate action rods, you still have good feeling with them, but they are not quite as sensitive as those fast action rods. So you may be asking yourself, well, when would I want a moderate action rod? Because I always want to have a lot of sensitivity. And this is really how I go about deciding which rod that I'm going to use, which action rod. We already know the right power to use based upon the weight of that lure. Now let's talk about how to pick the right action based upon that lure. To me, if I'm using a bait that has treble hooks on it, whether that is a crankbait or a lipless crankbait or a topwater bait, those baits that have treble hooks on them, typically they are hard baits, that is when I'm going to use that moderate action rod. And the biggest reason for this is because moderate action, more parabolic bending rods help you to keep bass hooked when they hit those baits with treble hooks. If you're using an extra fast action rod with treble hooks, a lot of times when that fish comes up to jump and he shakes, there's no give there on the rod. And because it's so stiff, you lose a lot of fish. So anytime I fish treble hooks, I'm using moderate action rods. Now on the flip side of things, if I am using a rod that has a single hook, baits like a jig, a spinner bait, a Texas rig, that is when I'm going to use that fast action rod. So that is how I go about deciphering what rod to use with my lures. Now there are a few exceptions to this rule, of course. The biggest one that I can think about is a chatterbait. A chatterbait has a single hook on it. So a lot of times you're gonna think, oh, it's a fast action rod type bait. I actually used to use fast action rods with a chatterbait all the time, and I did pretty well with them. But what I have found is because a chatterbait is constantly moving, you actually will hook up and hold bass better with a moderate action rod. The actual rod that I use is an ARC Tharp Series B Hitte rod. But for the most part, that is how you decide what rod to use with a lure. Even if I'm using really big swim baits, like you see right here, I have a bigger glide bait, but guess what? It has treble hooks on it. Even though this bait weighs 3-4 ounces, I'm using a heavy power rod because of the weight of that lure, but I'm still using a moderate action rod because of the treble hook. So I hope that this really helps you to decide exactly what lure to fish with what rod. If you guys want even more detail on this specific subject, I made a video right here on the Bass Fishing HQ channel where I go in depth on exactly what rod I use for pretty much every single lure out there. So if you guys enjoyed this video, you'll like this one as well. Please comment below, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.